In the wind-swept plains of rural Nebraska, where the horizon stretches endlessly and the sky tells stories of coming storms, a humble farmer made a decision that would forever alter the trajectory of his quiet existence. Elijah Parker, a weathered veteran with calloused hands and a nearly foreclosed farm, offered shelter to a stranded female Air Force pilot during the worst blizzard in 40 years. Their chance encounter lasted just 24 hours before Air Force One unexpectedly landed in his snow-covered field, bringing with it a revelation so extraordinary it would challenge everything Elijah believed about service, sacrifice, and the far-reaching consequences of long-forgotten heroism. Before we dive deeper, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed. Tomorrow I've got something truly remarkable coming that will leave you speechless. The winter of 2023 punished the Nebraska heartland with unrelenting fury. From his farmhouse window, Elijah Parker watched as another layer of snow blanketed his struggling fields, the biting wind sculpting massive drifts against his weathered barn. At 58, the lines etched deeply into his face told the story of a man who had weathered far more than harsh Midwestern seasons. Elijah wasn't born to hardship. His grandfather had established Parker Farms in 1945 after returning from World War II, transforming 180 acres of challenging terrain into productive cropland through sheer determination. Elijah's father had expanded it to 300 acres, introducing modern farming techniques while maintaining the family's reputation for integrity. Those days felt impossibly distant now. Elijah could still recall the scent of his mother's apple butter simmering on the stove, the sound of his father's patient instructions as they repaired equipment together in the workshop attached to the barn. But drought had come first, followed by plummeting corn prices. By the time Elijah reached his mid-50s, he had buried both parents in the small family cemetery beneath the old cottonwood tree. The bank had been circling like vultures ever since, eyeing the land that 3 generations of Parkers had poured their lives into. A man's only as good as his word, his father used to say. So Elijah had spent 4 years working himself to exhaustion trying to keep the farm afloat, taking on side jobs in the nearby town of Clearwater, repairing neighbors' equipment for whatever they could afford to pay, and selling off parcels of land piece by painful piece. Now he lived alone in the farmhouse that had once echoed with family gatherings, his worldly possessions whittled down to the essentials. His father's tools, his grandfather's medals from the Pacific Campaign, his mother's Bible, and a collection of military history books that had been his constant companion since childhood. Most precious was the worn photograph of his Marine unit in Afghanistan, taken 2 weeks before the ambush that sent him home with a Purple Heart, a titanium rod in his leg, and nightmares that still woke him some nights. On this particular afternoon, Elijah had just finished winterizing the irrigation system, a precaution against the bitter cold that had settled over the region. The weather forecast warned of a severe blizzard approaching from the northwest, with expected snowfall of 18 to 24 inches and wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour. He had already moved his small herd of cattle, all that remained, after selling most of his livestock into the barn and stockpiled enough firewood to last through what the meteorologists were calling a once-in-a-generation winter storm. Clearwater wasn't much of a town, just a collection of storefronts arranged around a single traffic light. Wilson's General Store, the First Farmers Bank of Nebraska, a small medical clinic, a gas station, and the Prairie Rose Diner, where Elijah occasionally treated himself to Marie's meatloaf special on Thursday evenings. The community had shrunk steadily as younger generations migrated to cities like Omaha and Lincoln, leaving behind an aging population struggling to maintain their way of life. Elijah guided his 20-year-old Ford pickup along the snow-covered road into town, the ancient heater struggling against the cold that seeped through every crack. As the first heavy flakes began to fall, he pulled into Wilson's general store, where he was greeted with a nod from Tom Wilson, whose family had run the establishment for nearly as long as the Parkers had farmed their land. "Cutting it close, Elijah," Tom commented as he rang up Elijah's supplies: batteries, canned goods, an extra propane tank, and some beef jerky. "They're saying this storm's going to shut everything down for days. Figured I better stock up." Elijah replied, counting out carefully budgeted cash. "Got the livestock situated, but wanted to make sure I had enough to get by if the power goes." Tom leaned across the counter, lowering his voice. "Heard anything from the bank lately? Sheriff mentioned Frank Roberts was talking about some properties they're looking to move on after the new year." Elijah's stomach tightened. Frank Roberts, the bank manager, had made it clear that his patience and the bank's forbearance was running thin. "Nothing official yet. Got the interest payment in last month, but principal's still behind. I'm hoping the spring wheat prices hold up enough to catch up." "You know," Tom said carefully, bagging Elijah's purchases, "my sister's boy works for that agricultural conglomerate, Heartland Consolidated. They're still looking to expand their holdings in the county. Might be worth a conversation, just to know your options." "Appreciate the thought, Tom," Elijah responded, his tone making it clear this wasn't a path he was ready to consider. 3 generations of Parkers had maintained their independence. Becoming tenant farmers on their own land would be a last resort. As Elijah loaded his supplies into the pickup, the snow began falling more heavily, reducing visibility to just a few hundred yards. The radio crackled with emergency alerts advising all residents to seek immediate shelter. He turned the truck toward home, the wheels occasionally slipping on the increasingly treacherous road. The 10-mile drive stretched to nearly 45 minutes as conditions deteriorated rapidly. By the time he pulled up to his farmhouse, the wind howled with frightening intensity, driving snow horizontally across the fields. Elijah unloaded his supplies quickly, made one final check on the livestock, and secured the barn doors with additional braces against the wind. Inside the farmhouse, he stoked the wood stove, positioned emergency lanterns strategically throughout the rooms, and settled in to wait out the storm. As darkness fell, the blizzard's full fury was unleashed. Wind shrieked around the eaves of the old farmhouse, finding every gap in the insulation. Snow accumulated rapidly, already reaching the bottom of the first-floor windows. The power flickered once, twice, then failed completely, leaving Elijah in the warm glow of the wood stove and kerosene lanterns. He was slicing bread for a simple dinner when a sound penetrated the storm's constant roar, a mechanical whine that seemed out of place among the wind's natural fury. Frowning, Elijah moved to the window, wiping condensation from the glass to peer out into the whiteness. At first, he saw nothing but swirling snow, but then a set of lights appeared, moving erratically above his northern field. Years of military training kicked in as Elijah quickly pulled on his heavy coat, grabbed a powerful flashlight, and stepped out onto the covered porch. The cold hit him like a physical blow, the wind nearly knocking him backward as he raised the light toward the mysterious object. The beam caught the outline of what appeared to be a small aircraft, a helicopter, dipping dangerously low over his property, clearly struggling against the storm's violent gusts. Without hesitation, Elijah waded into the knee-deep snow, angling, the flashlight upward in broad, sweeping motions to signal the pilot. The helicopter lurched sideways before steadying, then began a careful descent toward the relatively flat expanse of Elijah's southern field. He pushed forward through the drifts, the old injury in his leg protesting sharply as he forced his way toward the landing site. The helicopter touched down roughly, snow billowing around it as the rotors continued to spin. Elijah approached cautiously, shielding his eyes against the miniature blizzard created by the aircraft. The side door slid open, and a figure emerged, slender, moving with purpose despite the bulky flight suit and helmet. As the figure approached, Elijah raised his flashlight, illuminating the pilot's face as she lifted her visor. To his surprise, a woman with determined eyes and Lieutenant Colonel insignia stared back at him. "Colonel Alexandra Ramirez, United States Air Force," she shouted over the storm's roar. "I need to make an emergency landing. Can you provide shelter until this passes?" "Elijah Parker," he responded automatically. "My farm's just over there. Can you secure your aircraft?" She nodded sharply. "Need to shut down properly and grab my gear. 5 minutes." Elijah waited as she returned to the helicopter, the rotors finally slowing to a stop. The sudden absence of their mechanical whine made the storm seem momentarily louder. Colonel Ramirez emerged again, carrying a weatherproof case and what looked like a specialized communications device. Together, they battled through the snow toward the farmhouse, the journey of a few hundred yards becoming an exhausting ordeal against the storm's relentless assault. Once inside, Elijah quickly stoked the fire while the colonel removed her helmet and outer gear. In the warm light of the lanterns, he could see she was perhaps in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Parker," she said, her voice carrying the crispness of military precision. "I was on a routine training flight when we received urgent warnings about the storm's acceleration. I diverted toward Offutt Air Force Base, but the conditions deteriorated faster than predicted. Your lights were the only ones visible for miles." "Lucky." "I was still up," Elijah replied, putting a kettle on the wood stove. "Radio said this storm's going to last at least through tomorrow. You're welcome to wait it out here." Colonel Ramirez nodded her thanks, then immediately turned to the communications device she'd brought with her. "I need to report my position and status. Is there somewhere I can set up to transmit?" Elijah showed her to his father's old study, where the walls were thick enough to dampen the storm's noise. While she made her calls, he prepared a simple meal of soup and bread, setting the kitchen table with 2 bowls. When she returned, her expression had shifted subtly. Something in her posture suggested that her situation might be more complicated than a routine training flight gone awry. "Everything all right?" Elijah asked as they sat down to eat. "As well as can be expected," she replied carefully. "I've updated my command about my location. They're concerned, but glad I found safe harbor." She studied him for a moment. "You handled yourself well out there. Military background?" "Marines, 2 tours in Afghanistan, been home about 15 years now." She nodded, a flash of recognition and respect crossing her features. "I thought so. There's a certain way veterans move in a crisis, economical, purposeful." She glanced around the kitchen, taking in the worn but meticulously maintained furnishings. "This is your family farm?" "3rd generation. Elijah confirmed. My grandfather started it after serving in the Pacific. Not much compared to the big operations, but it's been enough for the Parkers. As they ate, the conversation flowed more naturally than Elijah would have expected. Colonel Ramirez spoke of her 20 years in the Air Force, flying everything, from cargo planes to test aircraft, while carefully avoiding specifics about her current assignment. Elijah found himself sharing stories about his grandfather's determination to transform rocky Nebraska soil into productive farmland, his father's innovations, and the challenges of maintaining a small independent farm in an era dominated by massive agricultural corporations. Sounds like we both come from people who don't give up easily, she observed, helping him clear the dishes after they'd finished eating. Stubbornness is a Parker family trait, Elijah admitted with a small smile. Not always a virtue when it comes to adapting to changing times. As the evening progressed, Elijah showed Colonel Ramirez to the guest room, which had remained largely unchanged since his mother's passing 7 years earlier. It's not much, but it's warm, he apologized, lighting another lantern for her. After 15 hours in a cockpit and a near-disaster landing, this looks like the Ritz-Carlton, she assured him. Thank you, Mr. Parker. Your hospitality won't be forgotten. Later, as Elijah was checking the wood stove one final time before retiring, he noticed Colonel Ramirez in his father's study again, her voice too low to make out words, but her tone suggesting urgency. When she emerged, her expression was composed once more, though a certain tension remained visible around her eyes. Everything secure with your helicopter? He asked, pretending he hadn't noticed her hushed conversation. As secure as possible given the conditions, she replied. My team will monitor its emergency beacon remotely. The forecast suggests the storm should break by mid-morning tomorrow. Elijah nodded, studying her face in the lantern light. There was something she wasn't saying, something beyond concern about an emergency landing or a delayed training mission. His years in military intelligence had taught him to recognize when information was being compartmentalized, but he also understood the protocols of classified operations. Whatever brought Colonel Alexandra Ramirez to his farm, it was likely above his former pay grade. Good night, Colonel, he said simply. If you need anything, I'm just down the hall. Alexandra, she corrected with a brief smile. Since we're storm-bound together, we might as well use first names. Elijah, then, he agreed. Sleep well, Alexandra. As he retired to his bedroom, the storm continued its assault on the farmhouse, but the familiar creaks and groans of the old structure were oddly comforting. For the first time in months, Elijah wasn't falling asleep, worried about bank notices, or crop yields, or the slow, inexorable decline of his family legacy. Instead, his thoughts turned to the unexpected guest down the hall and the peculiar circumstances that had brought an Air Force officer to his remote farm during the worst blizzard in decades. Little did he know that by this time tomorrow his quiet life would be completely upended, and the snowy field where Alexandra's helicopter had landed would become the site of an event so extraordinary that it would rewrite the final chapters of his family's story in ways he could never have imagined. Elijah woke before dawn, his internal clock unaffected by power outages or unexpected guests. The storm had subsided somewhat overnight. Though snow still fell steadily outside his frosted windows, the farmhouse felt unusually cold. The wood stove in the main room must have burned lower than he'd intended. Pulling on thick wool socks and a heavy sweater, he made his way quietly down the hallway, careful not to wake Alexandra. To his surprise, she was already up, kneeling before the wood stove and carefully arranging kindling beneath a new log. She had found his father's old flannel robe and wore it over her flight suit, the sleeves rolled up several times to free her hands. "Morning," she said, without turning around. "Hope you don't mind. It was getting chilly and I figured you could use a few more minutes of sleep." "Not at all," Elijah replied, oddly touched by the gesture. "Most city folks wouldn't know the first thing about getting a wood stove going." Alexandra smiled as she closed the stove door, adjusting the damper with practiced ease. "I grew up in rural Colorado. My father was a forest ranger. We lost power so often in winter that managing fire was a basic survival skill. This small revelation shifted Elijah's perception of her, not just a military officer temporarily grounded on his property, but someone who understood something of his world. "Coffee," he offered, moving toward the kitchen. "Still have plenty of water stored, and the stove's hot enough to boil it." "God." "Yes," she replied with sudden informality that made him smile. "Military runs on caffeine and determination, and I'm running low on both right now." While Elijah prepared breakfast, powdered eggs reconstituted with canned milk, the last of yesterday's. Bread toasted on the wood stove. Alexandra checked her communications equipment. Her expression grew increasingly concerned as she adjusted dials and attempted different frequencies. "Problem?" Elijah asked, setting a steaming mug beside her. "Storms interfering with transmission clarity," she explained, though something in her tone suggested there might be more to her concern. "I need to check on my helicopter as soon as it's light enough to safely get out there." They ate quickly, the windows gradually brightening from black to deep blue as dawn approached behind the cloud cover. The wind had died down considerably, though the temperature reading on Elijah's old porch thermometer showed -12 degrees when they finally ventured outside, bundled in multiple layers. "I appreciate that." She paused, seeming to debate internally before continuing. "Mr. Parker, Elijah, there's something I should tell you. The recovery team will be substantial. They'll need to secure this area temporarily." He turned, drying, his hands on a kitchen towel. "Military operation?" "Yes." She met his eyes directly. "I'm not at liberty to explain fully, but my flight wasn't standard training. I was transporting sensitive materials when the storm diverted me." "Classified?" She nodded once, a professional acknowledgement between people who understood the weight of that designation. "Your farm will likely see significant activity tomorrow," she continued. "You'll be compensated for any disruption, of course." Elijah absorbed this information silently. After a moment, he simply nodded. "I understand. Military needs to do what it needs to do." A flash of relief crossed her features, followed by what might have been respect. "Thank you. Many civilians would have a lot more questions." "I served," he replied simply. "Some questions don't get answers. Nature of the job." The day progressed quietly after that. With the immediate crisis of the storm past and Alexandra's status reported to her command, an unusual domesticity settled over the farmhouse. Elijah taught her the art of banking the wood stove for maximum efficiency. She helped him prepare a more substantial meal from his stored provisions, a surprisingly flavorful stew made with canned vegetables, preserved beef, and herbs from his mother's garden that he had dried last summer. As afternoon faded toward evening, they sat at the kitchen table with steaming mugs of coffee, the conversation turning to their respective military experiences. "Afghanistan, you said?" Alexandra asked. What years? 2002 to 2005, with a break in between tours, Elijah replied. Was with the 1st Intelligence Battalion. We provided tactical intelligence for ground operations. She nodded with recognition. I flew C-17s during that period, transport mainly. Brought troops in, equipment, sometimes flew the wounded out to Germany. Might have been on one of your planes then, he remarked. My last ride out was on a medical transport after our convoy hit an IED outside Kandahar. Alexandra studied him with new understanding. That explains the leg, titanium rod from knee to hip, he confirmed without self-pity. Lucky compared to some. 2 guys from my unit didn't make it home. A moment of silence hung between them. The unspoken recognition, shared by those who had seen war's realities firsthand. Why farming? She asked eventually. After intelligence work seems like a major shift. Elijah gazed out the window at the snow-covered fields, considering the question. Family legacy, partially. This land has had Parkers working it since 1945, but also, he paused, searching for words. After Afghanistan, I needed something real, something I could touch, something that grew. Intelligence work is all shadows and maybes, farming straightforward. You plant, you tend, you harvest. The enemies are weather and markets, not people. Alexandra nodded slowly. I understand that. Need for tangible results. Flying feels that way to me. Direct connection between action and outcome. As darkness fell once more, Elijah lit the kerosene lamps, their warm glow creating pools of light throughout the farmhouse. The power remained out, but the wood stove kept the main rooms comfortably warm. They moved to the living room, where generations of Parkers had weathered storms before them. Alexandra noticed the photographs on the mantelpiece. 3 generations of men standing proudly beside farm equipment of their eras. The land behind, them unchanging while technology evolved. Another frame held a faded color photograph of a young Elijah in dress blues, his posture perfect, eyes forward with military precision. Your family has a strong tradition of service, she observed, noting the similarity between Elijah's Marine portrait and an older black-and-white image of a man in a World War II uniform. Grandfather was at Iwo Jima, Elijah explained, following her gaze. Dad was too young for Korea, but served stateside during Vietnam. Parker men tend to answer when called. Alexandra picked up another photograph, Elijah's unit in Afghanistan. Dust-covered men squinting into harsh sunlight, mountains rising behind them. You miss it? She asked quietly. The service? Elijah considered the question carefully. Miss the purpose sometimes, the clarity, knowing exactly what needed doing and why. He gestured toward the window, beyond which lay his struggling farm. Harder to find that clarity here lately. Banks don't care about family legacy or what this land means. They see numbers on spreadsheets, not generations of sweat equity. The farm's in trouble. Her question was direct but not pitying. The landscape that greeted them was transformed. Snow had drifted against the farmhouse to halfway up the first-floor windows on the windward side. The barn stood like a snow-covered mountain, only its roof visible in some places. Most striking was the absolute silence. The storm had muffled the world under a thick white blanket that absorbed every sound. My grandfather used to call this God's reset button, Elijah remarked, as they stood on the porch surveying the scene. Said a good blizzard reminds humans how small we really are. Alexandra nodded thoughtfully. We like to believe we've conquered nature until moments like this. She zipped her coat higher against the cold. I need to check the helicopter. The navigation system contains sensitive information. Elijah grabbed 2 shovels from beside the porch. We'll need to clear a path. That field's got drifts that could swallow a man whole. The journey to the helicopter proved arduous. What had been a short walk the previous night now required strategic path-breaking through snow that in places reached their chests. Elijah's injured leg protested with each laborious step, but he pushed through the familiar pain with the discipline honed during his military rehabilitation. Alexandra noticed his slight limp becoming more pronounced, but said nothing, recognizing the pride of a fellow service member. Instead, she took the lead in breaking trail where the snow was deepest, allowing him to follow in her footsteps. When they finally reached the helicopter, it sat like an alien artifact amidst the pristine white landscape, its dark shape incongruous against the endless expanse of snow. Alexandra immediately began clearing access to the cockpit door while Elijah caught his breath, leaning against his shovel. Doesn't look damaged, he observed, studying the aircraft with the eye of someone who had maintained complex farm machinery for decades. Skids seem intact, no obvious stress to the airframe from what I can see. It's a tough bird, Alexandra agreed, pulling open the cockpit door and climbing inside. Designed to handle worse conditions than this in theory, though last night was pushing its operational limits. She busied herself checking instruments and secure compartments while Elijah waited outside, surveying the surrounding fields. The snow was beginning to taper off, and breaks in the cloud cover allowed occasional glimpses of blue sky. In the new light, he could fully appreciate the isolation of his property. No other structures were visible in any direction, just the undulating white expanse stretching to the horizon. "How are the roads?" Alexandra asked when she emerged from the helicopter, locking it securely behind her. Elijah shook his head. "Won't be passable for days. County doesn't have enough plows to clear the main highways quickly, let alone rural routes like mine. We're effectively an island until they get to us." She frowned, glancing at her watch. "I need to report in. The storm's interference should be lessening with the cloud cover breaking up." Back at the farmhouse, Alexandra disappeared into the study with her communications equipment, while Elijah began the process of checking on his livestock. The cattle were restless after being confined overnight, but all had weathered the storm safely. He distributed feed and fresh water, his movements efficient from decades of routine. When he returned to the house, stamping snow from his boots on the porch, Alexandra was waiting for him in the kitchen. Her expression had changed, a new tension, evident in her posture, a military alertness that hadn't been there before. "Everything all right with your command?" he asked, hanging his coat by the door. "They've dispatched recovery personnel," she replied carefully. "Weather permitting, they should reach us by tomorrow morning." Elijah nodded, sensing she was sharing only part of the information. He recognized the careful compartmentalization. He'd done the same during his time in military intelligence, revealing only what civilians needed to know. "Well, you're welcome to stay until they arrive," he said, moving to the sink to wash his hands. "Not much in the way of entertainment out here, but we'll stay warm and fed. Like most small operations these days," he acknowledged. "Can't compete with the corporate mega-farms on price. 3 bad years in a row burned through my reserves. Bank's patience is running thin." Alexandra returned the photograph to its place. "What will you do if I lose it?" Elijah finished for her. "Haven't figured that part out yet. Kept hoping I wouldn't have to." He changed the subject deliberately. "You have family waiting for your return somewhere." She accepted the conversational shift gracefully. "Parents still in Colorado. No husband, no kids. The Air Force has been my family for 20 years now. No regrets about that choice?" Alexandra smiled slightly. "Some days yes, some days no. Life is about trade-offs, isn't it? I've seen things most people never will, served my country in ways that mattered. But I've missed birthdays, funerals, the ordinary moments that build a civilian life." She shrugged. "We make our choices and live with them." The honesty of her answer resonated with Elijah. They fell into comfortable silence. Two battle-tested souls who understood sacrifice and duty in their bones, finding unexpected connection in a snowbound farmhouse far from their respective worlds. Later, as they prepared for their second night under the same roof, Alexandra paused in the hallway. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For not asking questions I can't answer, for understanding what service means." She smiled briefly. "For making surprisingly good stew from canned goods." Elijah returned the smile, surprising himself with how natural it felt after months of solitary worry. "Get some rest, Colonel. Sounds like tomorrow will be a busy day for both of us." They parted ways to their respective rooms, the farmhouse settling around them with the familiar creaks and sighs of an old structure cooling in the night. Outside, stars emerged as the clouds dispersed, their cold light reflecting brilliantly off the snow-covered landscape. Elijah lay awake longer than usual, his mind turning over the strange circumstance that had brought an Air Force colonel to his doorstep. Something about Alexandra Ramirez's mission didn't quite add up. Routine training flights didn't typically carry sensitive materials, nor did they warrant substantial recovery teams. His intelligence training nagged at him, the habit of analyzing inconsistencies never quite abandoned despite his years of civilian life. Eventually, he drifted to sleep, unaware that the following day would bring not just the promised military recovery team, but revelations that would connect his family's past to Alexandra's mission in ways he could never have anticipated. As he slept, the clouds parted completely, revealing a clear winter sky above his snow-encircled farm, a brief moment of peace before the extraordinary events about to unfold. Elijah woke to an unfamiliar sound, a low, distant rumble that penetrated the pre-dawn stillness. He lay perfectly still, his mind cataloguing the noise before recognition dawned. Aircraft, multiple engines approaching from the east, military based on the sound signature, much larger than Alexandra's helicopter, glancing at the bedside clock that had stopped when the power failed. He estimated it was around 5:30 a.m., based on the faint glow at his window. Earlier than expected for a recovery team. He dressed quickly in the cold room, choosing warm layers that would allow him to work outdoors if necessary. The hallway was dark, but a strip of light showed beneath the guest room door. Alexandra was already awake. No surprise there. Military personnel developed an internal alarm that often preceded actual operations. He found her in the kitchen, fully dressed in her flight suit, communications equipment assembled on the table. She looked up as he entered, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes alert with tension. "Your people are early," Elijah commented, moving to kindle the wood stove. "Not mine," she replied. Her tone clipped as she adjusted a dial on her device. "At least not who I was expecting." That caught his attention. "Then who? I don't know yet." She held up a hand for silence as she listened to something through her headset. After a moment, she removed it, her expression shifting toward what Elijah recognized as controlled concern. Multiple aircraft approaching, heavy transport class, no scheduled recovery until 0800 hours. Could the timetable have changed? Weather's clear now. Possibly. She didn't sound convinced. But protocol would require notification. She paused, then added with careful precision, "The package I was transporting is extremely high value. There are contingencies in place if it's compromised." The implications of her statement hung in the air between them. This wasn't a simple training mission gone awry. Alexandra was carrying something significant enough to warrant elaborate security protocols. "What do you need from me?" Elijah asked. Bypassing questions he knew she couldn't answer. She assessed him briefly, making a decision. "I need to reach my helicopter and secure the package before they land, whoever they are. Can you provide cover? Cover as in greet whoever arrives while I retrieve what I need to retrieve. Buy me time." Elijah nodded, military instincts from years ago clicking smoothly back into place. "I can do that." She checked her watch. "Aircraft ETA approximately 10 minutes, based on sound signature. We need to move now." They dressed quickly for the bitter cold, Alexandra donning her flight jacket over her uniform. Elijah grabbed his old service pistol from the locked cabinet in his bedroom. Not that he expected trouble on his own property, but 15 years of civilian life hadn't erased his training. Better prepared than surprised. Outside, the world remained transformed by snow, but the sky had cleared completely, revealing a brilliant blue expanse overhead. The temperature had plummeted during the night, their breath hung in frozen clouds before them as they trudged through the deep drifts. "Go around the barn," Elijah instructed, pointing to a less visible path. "Less exposed that way. I'll head toward the main drive to intercept our visitors." Alexandra nodded sharply, military efficiency in her movements. 15 minutes, 20 maximum. Understood. They separated, Alexandra disappearing behind the massive red barn, while Elijah made his way toward the long driveway that connected his property to the county road. The aircraft sounds grew steadily louder. Multiple engines, definitely military. Transports based on the distinctive pitch. From his vantage point, Elijah spotted them first as distant specks against the morning sky, then clearly as they began circling his property. 3 V-22 Ospreys, tilt-rotor aircraft capable of vertical takeoff and landing, their unique silhouettes unmistakable against the cloudless blue. Sophisticated transport aircraft used by special operations, definitely not standard recovery. For a downed pilot, the Ospreys circled once, then descended toward the flattest portion of his property, ironically the same field where Alexandra had landed her helicopter, though much farther from the farmhouse. Their rotors kicked up miniature blizzards as they settled onto the snow-covered ground with surprising precision. Elijah adjusted his course to intercept whoever emerged, mentally calculating that Alexandra should reach her helicopter undisturbed. As the new arrivals were landing nearly half a mile from her position, he squared his shoulders and adopted the confident posture that had served him well as a Marine, despite the civilian years that had passed since. The lead Osprey's ramp lowered first, and Elijah felt his stomach tighten as the first figures emerged. Not standard Air Force recovery personnel, but a tactical team in winter camouflage, weapons at the ready position, not quite aimed, but certainly prepared for trouble. 8 operators deployed in textbook formation, establishing a perimeter around the aircraft. From the second Osprey emerged what appeared to be technical specialists carrying equipment cases, while the third remained sealed, its engines idling. The entire operation spoke of high-level security protocols. A figure detached from the tactical team and approached Elijah, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose bearing marked him as the commanding officer despite the uniform similarities. He stopped at a conversational distance, assessing Elijah with practiced efficiency. "Sir, I'm going to need you to identify yourself," the man said, his tone professional but leaving no room for refusal. "Elijah Parker, this is my farm you've landed on." He kept his voice steady, neither hostile nor intimidated. "And you are?" "Major Stephen Walsh, United States Air Force Special Operations." The man studied Elijah's face carefully. "Mr. Parker, we're responding to an emergency beacon from a downed aircraft. Our intelligence indicates the pilot may have sought shelter in this vicinity." Elijah noted the careful wording. They weren't asking if Alexandra was here. They were stating what they already knew while gauging his reaction. He maintained a neutral expression. "You're referring to Colonel Ramirez." A flicker of something, relief perhaps, crossed Major Walsh's features. "Yes, sir. Her location is of highest priority to national security. Is she currently on your property?" Elijah gestured toward the farmhouse. "She took shelter with me during the storm. My understanding is that a recovery team wasn't expected until 800 hours. Major Walsh exchanged glances with another officer who had joined them. "Plans accelerated due to changing circumstances. We need to speak with Colonel Ramirez immediately." "She went to check on her helicopter about 20 minutes ago," Elijah replied truthfully. "It's on the other side of my property. I'd be happy to take you there." The major nodded, then spoke quietly into his communication device. Within moments, the tactical team had redeployed, 2 members remaining with the aircraft while the others formed an escort pattern around Elijah and the officers. As they trudged through the snow toward the helicopter's location, Elijah managed. What he hoped was casual conversation. Pretty significant response for a weather-diverted pilot. "Colonel Ramirez is a valued officer," Major Walsh replied neutrally. "And her cargo must be equally valuable," Elijah observed, watching for reactions. The Major's expression remained controlled, but his stride faltered almost imperceptibly. "What did the colonel tell you about her mission, Mr. Parker?" "Just that she was transporting sensitive materials and got caught in the storm," Elijah responded honestly. "I didn't ask questions. I served myself, Marines, Afghanistan. I understand operational security." This information seemed to relax the Major slightly. "Appreciate your discretion, Mr. Parker, and your service." They crested a small rise, bringing Alexandra's helicopter into view. She stood beside it, composed and professional in her flight gear, a secure case clutched under one arm. She showed no surprise at the tactical team approaching. Clearly she'd heard their arrival and prepared accordingly. "Major Walsh," she greeted the officer with crisp formality. "You're ahead of schedule." "Circumstances changed, Colonel," he replied, matching her tone. "Package secure." She patted the case under her arm. "Affirmative. Never left my possession." A visible tension seemed to leave the assembled officers. Elijah remained silent, observing the interaction with the analytical precision he'd honed during his intelligence days. Something significant was happening, something well beyond a routine aircraft recovery. Major Walsh turned to Elijah. "Mr. Parker, thank you for your assistance to Colonel Ramirez. We'll need to debrief you briefly, then we'll be out of your way. Of course, Elijah agreed, though something in the Major's too careful phrasing suggested the debriefing might not be as brief or straightforward as implied. As they walked back toward the waiting ospreys, Alexandra fell into step beside Elijah, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "Thank you for the diversion. It worked perfectly." "Who are they really?" he murmured. "Not standard recovery." "No," she confirmed quietly. "Special security detachment. Something's happened that accelerated the timeline." Before she could elaborate, Major Walsh rejoined them, effectively ending their private conversation. "Colonel, we need to establish a secure perimeter around the property while technical teams evaluate your aircraft. Standard protocol." "Understood." "Major," she turned to Elijah. "Mr. Parker, I apologize for the disruption to your farm. The Air Force will ensure any damage is compensated." The formality felt strange after their shared hours during the storm, but Elijah recognized the necessary shift back to military protocols. "No apology needed, Colonel. Glad to be of service." At the Ospreys, the situation evolved rapidly. Technical specialists deployed toward Alexandra's helicopter, while communications officers established a portable command center alongside the lead aircraft. Elijah found himself escorted to this station, where a senior officer waited with what appeared to be official documentation. "Mr. Parker, I'm Colonel James Harrington," the man introduced himself, offering a firm handshake. "I understand you provided critical assistance to Colonel Ramirez during her emergency situation." "Just did what anyone would do," Elijah replied, uncomfortable with the formality. "She needed shelter during a blizzard." Colonel Harrington smiled thinly. "Nevertheless, your actions potentially safeguarded sensitive national security assets. We'll need you to review and sign these non-disclosure agreements." He pushed forward several official-looking documents with multiple tabbed signature pages. Elijah glanced at the top sheet, noting the severe penalties listed for disclosure of classified information. "Standard procedure," Harrington added, almost apologetically. "Given what you may have been exposed to," Elijah began reviewing the documents, with the carefulness ingrained during his military service, while around him the operation continued to expand. Additional personnel deployed equipment around the perimeter of his property, establishing what looked suspiciously like a security cordon. As he signed the final page, his attention was drawn to a new sound, different from the Ospreys. Heavier, more powerful. The officers around him straightened perceptibly, several touching their communication devices as if receiving new instructions. Colonel Harrington collected the signed documents quickly. "Mr. Parker, we're going to need to relocate. Temporarily, standard security protocol. Relocate. This is my farm. I'm not leaving my livestock unattended." "Your animals will be cared for, sir," Harrington assured him, though his attention had clearly shifted to the new aircraft approaching. "This is a matter of highest national security." Before Elijah could protest further, Major Walsh and two security personnel approached. "Mr. Parker, please come with us. We need to establish a wider security perimeter immediately." The urgency in their manner brooked no argument. Elijah found himself escorted firmly but respectfully toward one of the Ospreys, confusion mounting as the activity around him intensified. Alexandra was nowhere to be seen, presumably already secured with her mysterious package. As they reached the aircraft, Elijah turned to look at the source of the new engine noise. and felt his breath catch. Approaching from the east, unmistakable, even at a distance, was the distinctive blue and white form of Air Force One. "That's," he began, unable to complete the sentence. "Yes, sir," Major Walsh confirmed, his voice now holding a note of respect rather than just professional courtesy. "Now you understand why we need to secure the area." The presidential aircraft circled once, majestically, before beginning its approach to the makeshift landing zone being hastily established in Elijah's largest field. In the clear morning light, the aircraft's iconic profile stood out dramatically against the snow-covered Nebraska landscape, an utterly surreal sight above the modest Parker family farm. "Why here?" Elijah asked, unable to reconcile the extraordinary scene unfolding before him. "There are proper air bases within range." Major Walsh exchanged glances with Colonel Harrington, who had joined them. After a moment's silent communication, Harrington nodded slightly. "Mr. Parker," the major began carefully, "the President was already en route to Offutt Air Force Base for a scheduled briefing when we located Colonel Ramirez. Given the nature of what she was transporting, he diverted to receive it personally." "What exactly was she carrying that warrants a presidential visit to my farm?" Elijah asked, knowing he was pushing boundaries, but unable to contain his bewilderment. Harrington's expression remained controlled. "That remains classified, Mr. Parker, even with your signed NDAs. Suffice it to say, it's a matter of highest national importance." As Air Force One made its final approach, the security personnel urged Elijah into the Osprey. He complied, still struggling to process the stunning turn of events. Through the aircraft's window, he watched as the massive presidential plane touched down, with surprising delicacy on his snow-covered field, its engines sending crystalline clouds billowing across the landscape. The security operation transformed. Again, personnel moving with renewed purpose as the presidential entourage prepared to disembark. From his position inside the Osprey, Elijah could see the standard security protocols activating, Secret Service agents deploying in protective formations, communications specialists establishing secure links. What he couldn't understand was why his remote farm had suddenly become the center of what appeared to be a major national security operation. Why Alexandra's sensitive materials warranted presidential attention. Why, after years of quiet struggle against bank foreclosures and declining agricultural markets, his family's land had suddenly become the focus of such extraordinary attention. As he watched the presidential seal on Air Force One gleam in the morning sunlight, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than a simple aircraft emergency, something that connected to him in ways he didn't yet understand. Alexandra's careful avoidance of specifics, the overblown security response, and now a presidential visit to his remote Nebraska farm. None of it made logical sense. Unless there was something about Parker Farms, or perhaps about Elijah Parker himself, that he didn't know. The Osprey's door sealed shut, cutting off his view of the unfolding scene. The engines whined to life, and Elijah felt the distinctive sensation of vertical liftoff. They were relocating him, just as Colonel Harrington had said, removing him from his own property while whatever operation was underway completed its mysterious purpose. As the aircraft gained altitude, Elijah caught a final glimpse of his farmhouse, the home his grandfather had built after returning from war, the legacy 3 generations of Parkers had poured their lives into, now surrounded by military vehicles and personnel with the president of the United States, about to set foot on soil that the bank was threatening to reclaim. The irony wasn't lost on him. After years of struggling to save his family's land from financial institutions that saw it as merely collateral on a balance sheet, he was now being physically removed from it by his own government for reasons no one would fully explain. What possible connection could exist between his struggling farm, Alexandra's classified cargo, and the highest office in the land? As the Osprey carried him away from the extraordinary scene below, Elijah determined that when this bizarre situation concluded, he would demand answers, regardless of non-disclosure agreements or military protocols. After all, it was still his land. For now, at least. The Osprey carried Elijah to a position approximately 3 miles from his farm, close enough to maintain operational continuity, but far enough to ensure complete security around the presidential visit. They touched down in the center of a hastily established perimeter marked by military vehicles and portable barriers. As Elijah disembarked, he recognized they had landed on the property of his nearest neighbor, the Wilsons, whose family had farmed adjacent land for nearly as long as the Parkers. The Wilson farmhouse stood dark and empty in the distance. The C.E. family had evacuated to stay with relatives in Omaha before the blizzard hit. Now their property had been commandeered as a temporary military outpost without anyone even needing to ask permission. The power of presidential security protocols was impressive in its efficiency, if concerning in its reach. "Mr. Parker, please." "Follow me," instructed a young lieutenant who had clearly been assigned as his handler. "We've established a temporary waiting area where you'll be comfortable until the operation concludes." The waiting area proved to be the Wilsons' living room, hastily converted into a secure holding space. The furniture remained, but communications equipment had been set up on the dining table, and 2 armed security personnel stood at strategic positions, not explicitly guarding Elijah, but certainly ensuring he remained where placed. "Can someone explain what's happening on my farm?" Elijah asked the lieutenant, who was already backing toward the door. "Sir, I'm not authorized to brief you on the current operation," the young officer replied with practiced diplomacy. "Someone will update you when appropriate. Coffee and food are available in the kitchen. Please make yourself comfortable." Comfortable while being detained on my neighbor's property. Elijah's tone remained even, but his frustration was evident. The lieutenant hesitated. "You're not detained, sir. You're being accommodated for security purposes, and if I decided to walk back to my own farm right now, I would strongly advise against that action, sir. The security perimeter is active with lethal protocols." Elijah nodded slowly. "So I'm free to go, but I'll be shot if I try." "Got it." The lieutenant had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Someone will be with you shortly, Mr. Parker." He retreated, leaving Elijah with the silent security personnel who maintained professional disinterest in the exchange. Left with few options, Elijah explored his temporary prison. The Wilsons' home was similar to his own, a multi-generational farmhouse built in the post-war era, modernized in small increments as funds allowed. Photos of family milestones lined the walls: graduations, weddings, new tractors purchased after particularly good harvest years. The familiar rhythm of farm life captured in fading photographs. In the kitchen, he found the promised coffee, military grade, strong enough to dissolve a spoon, and pre-packaged sandwiches clearly brought in with the security team. He wasn't particularly hungry, but he recognized the value of maintaining his strength Whatever was happening, he wanted to be clear-headed when explanations finally came. Through the windows, he could see the perimeter security, military vehicles positioned at regular intervals, personnel establishing a defensive formation that seemed excessive even for a presidential visit. Something about this operation went beyond standard protocols. Elijah had nearly finished his coffee when the front door opened, admitting Colonel Harrington and, to his surprise, Alexandra. She had changed from her flight suit into a formal Air Force dress uniform, complete with her full array of ribbons and decorations, an impressive display that confirmed his earlier impression of her distinguished career. "Mr. Parker," Harrington began formally, "thank you for your cooperation." Elijah set down his cup carefully. "Not that I was given much choice." "Sir," Alexandra interjected, her tone professional but with a hint of the familiarity they had established. "During the storm, I understand this situation must seem extraordinary." "That's putting it mildly, Colonel. 24 hours ago, you were a stranded pilot in my guest room. Now the president is on my farm. I've been removed from my own property, and no one will tell me why." Alexandra exchanged glances with Harrington, who nodded slightly, permission granted for limited disclosure. "Mr. Parker," she began, choosing her words with evident care, "the cargo I was transporting was of significant historical importance. Documents and artifacts recently recovered from a secured intelligence archive. Materials that have direct relevance to ongoing national security matters." "What does any of that have to do with my farm?" Harrington stepped forward. "Mr. Parker, were you aware that your grandfather, Sergeant William Parker, served in Marine intelligence operations during the Pacific Campaign?" The question caught Elijah off guard. Of course, he never talked much about it. Most of that generation didn't. But his service record is part of our family history. Purple Heart at Iwo Jima. Your grandfather's service extended beyond what appears in public records, Harrington continued. He was attached to a specialized intelligence unit tasked with code interception and analysis. His work was classified at the highest levels. Elijah's confusion deepened. "My grandfather was a farm boy from Nebraska who enlisted after Pearl Harbor. He came home, started this farm, and lived a quiet life. Whatever classified work he did ended in 1945. Alexandra shook her head slightly. "Not entirely. The documents I was transporting included recently declassified intelligence reports from post-war debriefings. Your grandfather's name appears prominently. In what context?" "Operation Blackbird," Harrington supplied, "a top-secret initiative to secure critical intelligence in the final days of the Pacific Campaign. Your grandfather was instrumental in recovering encryption materials that potentially saved thousands of American lives during the planned invasion of the Japanese mainland." Elijah absorbed this information slowly. His grandfather, the quiet, methodical man who had taught him to fish and mend fences, had apparently played a more significant role in history than family stories had ever suggested. "That's unexpected," he acknowledged. "But it still doesn't explain the presidential visit to my farm 80 years later." Alexandra stepped closer, her expression earnest. "The materials I was carrying included your grandfather's full debriefing. In it, he mentioned hiding additional recovered documents that were never turned over to official channels. According to the transcript, he secured these items where no one would think to look, beneath the new American roots I plan to put down." "You think he hid something on this farm?" Elijah couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. That's why all of this, he gestured to the security apparatus visible through the window, is happening. A treasure hunt based on an old debriefing record. Not just any materials, Harrington clarified. Based on contextual analysis, we believe your grandfather may have secured a specific codebook that the intelligence community has been searching for since 1945. A key that could potentially decrypt thousands of intercepted messages from the late war period that have remained unreadable. Elijah ran a hand through his hair, struggling to reconcile this information with the grandfather he had known. If he hid something here, why wouldn't he have told my father? Or me? We've worked every inch of that land for 3 generations. The classification level was absolute, Alexandra explained. Taking any materials would have constituted a serious breach of security protocols. Your grandfather would have been bound by his oath of service to maintain absolute secrecy. But he kept something anyway? That doesn't sound like the William Parker I knew. Harrington's expression softened slightly. Many servicemen made complicated choices in wartime, Mr. Parker. The historical record suggests your grandfather believed these particular materials contained information too sensitive for the geopolitical realities of 1945. His debriefing indicates he intended to protect this information until a time when it could be properly contextualized. The implications slowly dawned on Elijah. And now you think that time has come. That's why the president himself has shown up on my doorstep? Alexandra nodded. The geopolitical situation has evolved. Information from that era has taken on new significance with current intelligence challenges in the Pacific region. If your grandfather secured what we think he did, it could provide critical contextual understanding for ongoing diplomatic initiatives. Elijah stood, moving to the window to stare out at the security perimeter. So, what happens now? You tear up my farm looking for an 80-year-old codebook that may or may not exist. That's not our intention, Alexandra assured him. The president has authorized a careful, non-invasive investigation using ground-penetrating radar and other technologies. That won't damage your property. And if nothing is found, you've disrupted my life, my farm operations, for what could be a wild goose chase based on a cryptic comment in a decades-old debriefing. Harrington stepped forward. Mr. Parker, regardless of what is or isn't found, your cooperation in this matter has been noted at the highest levels. The president has been briefed on your current financial circumstances. Elijah stiffened. My personal business is not a matter of national security. No, Harrington agreed, but the preservation of your family's farm, land that may contain materials of historical significance, has become a matter of national interest. Arrangements are being made regardless of the search outcome. The implication hung in the air. Help us, and your financial problems disappear. The offer, though unspoken, was clear. Elijah felt a complex surge of emotions. Relief at the prospect of saving his farm, discomfort at the transactional nature of the assistance, and lingering confusion about his grandfather's secret past. I want to go back, he said finally. If you're searching my property, I should be present. Alexandra and Harrington exchanged glances again. After a moment, Harrington nodded. That can be arranged. With appropriate security protocols, Colonel Ramirez will escort you. As Harrington left to make the necessary arrangements, Elijah turned to Alexandra. With the senior officer gone, her posture relaxed slightly. I'm sorry for the deception, she said quietly. When I landed on your farm, I had no idea of the connection. It wasn't until I reported your name during my secure communication that the significance became clear. So all that time we spent talking, you were just waiting for your people to connect the dots? No! Her denial came swiftly, her expression earnest. The storm, the emergency landing, that was all real. My mission was to transport the recently declassified archives to a secure facility for presidential review. The connection to your family only emerged after I reported taking shelter with you. Elijah studied her face, searching for signs of continued deception. Finding none, he sighed heavily. My grandfather was a man of absolute integrity. If he kept something from official channels, he must have had compelling reasons. The historical record suggests he did, Alexandra agreed. The immediate post-war period was complicated. Information was sometimes selectively managed, based on emerging Cold War realities. And now the government wants what he kept hidden. Times change. Contexts evolve. What needed protection then might serve a different purpose now. Their conversation was interrupted by the return of Harrington, accompanied by 2 security personnel. We're ready to transport you back to your property, Mr. Parker. The President has specifically requested your presence. The reality of the situation hit Elijah anew. He was about to meet the commander-in-chief on his own farm in connection with classified activities his grandfather had apparently participated in decades before his birth. The ordinary struggles of agricultural life had been abruptly replaced by matters of historical significance and national security. The return journey to Parker Farms passed in silence, Elijah processing the revelations about his family history, while Alexandra maintained professional distance in the presence of additional personnel. As they approached his property, the full scale of the operation became apparent. Dozens of vehicles, specialized equipment positioned around his fields, and security measures that had transformed his modest farm into what resembled a military installation. Air Force One stood majestically in the center of his largest field, incongruously modern and gleaming against the rural Nebraska landscape. Around it, concentric rings of security had been established, with personnel and vehicles creating a protective barrier between the presidential aircraft and the outside world. Their transport landed near the farmhouse, which had been incorporated into the security perimeter. Elijah noted with a mixture of bewilderment and appreciation that someone had attended to his livestock. Fresh hay had been distributed in the barn, and the cattle appeared undisturbed despite the unprecedented activity surrounding them. As they disembarked, Alexandra resumed her role as his escort, guiding him through security checkpoints where his identity was verified multiple times despite her presence. The protocols were meticulous, if somewhat surreal, when applied to a man trying to re-enter his own property. The technical team has been using ground-penetrating radar around the original farmhouse foundation, Alexandra explained as they walked. Based on historical records, we identified the section your grandfather built immediately after returning from service. The root cellar, Elijah said suddenly, pieces clicking into place. It's the only part of the original structure that remains unchanged since 1945. New American roots. He could have meant that literally. Alexandra's pace quickened, slightly. That area was scheduled for examination this afternoon. We should, Mr. Parker, A new voice interrupted, authoritative but welcoming. Elijah turned to find himself face to face with a distinguished man in his early 60s, flanked by Secret Service agents, but approaching with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. Though they had never met, his identity was unmistakable. "Mr. President," Elijah responded automatically, years of military training kicking in as he straightened his posture. "Thank you for your cooperation in this unusual circumstance," the president said, extending his hand. "Your family's service to this nation apparently spans generations, though in quite different forms." Elijah shook the offered hand, still processing the surreal nature of the encounter. "Sir, I'm still trying to understand exactly what my grandfather might have done." "As are we all," the president replied with a wry smile. "History has a way of revealing itself in unexpected moments." He gestured toward the farmhouse. "Colonel, Ramirez tells me you've identified a possible location for what we're seeking. Would you be willing to accompany the search team? Having a family member present would be both appropriate and potentially helpful." "Of course, Mr. President." "Excellent. I'll join you shortly. There are a few matters requiring my attention first." As the president moved away with his entourage, Alexandra led Elijah toward the farmhouse, where a technical team had already assembled near the entrance to the root cellar. A heavy wooden door set at an angle against the foundation, leading to the underground storage space that generations of Parkers had used to preserve harvests through harsh Nebraska winters. "We've conducted preliminary scans," a technician informed them, "but the composition of the floor is creating interference. Multiple layers of materials, probably accumulated over decades of use." "My grandfather poured the original concrete floor," Elijah offered. "My father added flagstones in the 60s. I put in a moisture barrier about 10 years ago when we had a wet season." The technician nodded. "That explains the layered returns we're getting. With your permission, we'd like to remove a section of the flooring for direct examination." Elijah hesitated only briefly before nodding. This root cellar held generations of family history, but if his grandfather had indeed hidden something here, perhaps it was finally time for it to emerge. Under carefully controlled conditions, the technical team began removing the flagstones Elijah identified as covering the oldest section of the cellar. Beneath them, just as he had described, lay a concrete floor poured shortly after World War II, when building materials had finally become available to returning veterans, establishing new lives. The work proceeded methodically, with scanning equipment, checking each exposed section before any material was disturbed. Alexandra remained at Elijah's side, her presence somehow reassuring amid the clinical precision of the operation. "There," announced one of the technicians suddenly, indicating a scanning display. "Anomalous density variation in this section. Approximately 2 feet square centered under this area." The team focused their efforts on the indicated spot, carefully removing the deteriorating concrete to reveal what lay beneath. Elijah watched intently as decades of family history were literally uncovered layer by layer. When they finally broke through, a collective hush fell over the assembled personnel. Nestled in a carefully constructed void beneath the concrete lay a military-issue waterproof case, the kind used to protect critical documents during amphibious operations in the Pacific. Despite 80 years underground, the seal appeared intact, preserved by the dry conditions and meticulous preparation. "That's Marine Corps equipment," Elijah said quietly, recognizing the design from historical photographs. Standard issue for intelligence units during the island campaigns. The technical lead looked to Alexandra for instructions. She turned to Elijah. It's your grandfather's legacy. Perhaps you should be the one to open it. Before Elijah could respond, movement at the cellar entrance drew their attention. The president had arrived, accompanied by minimal security, his expression reflecting genuine historical interest rather than mere political obligation. "Mr. Parker," he said, his voice carrying natural authority even in the confined space, "it appears your grandfather left us a time capsule of sorts. With your permission, I'd like to witness its opening firsthand." The moment crystallized for Elijah, his struggling farm, his grandfather's secret past, the confluence of personal history and national security, all converging in this underground room that had been part of his family's daily life for generations. Whatever William Parker had hidden here, the time for its revelation had apparently arrived. With careful movements, Elijah knelt beside the case, aware of the historical weight of the moment, and the attentive eyes of the president, Alexandra, and the assembled personnel. The latch mechanisms had corroded slightly, but yielded to firm pressure. As he lifted the lid, preserving the integrity of the weathered seal as much as possible, the contents came into view. A bound leather portfolio, military cipher pads, and a sealed envelope addressed simply, "For when it matters most." The sudden silence in the root cellar seemed at odds with the historical significance of the moment. Elijah carefully lifted the sealed envelope from the case, the paper yellowed, but remarkably preserved. His grandfather's handwriting was unmistakable. The same precise script that had labeled seed packets and equipment inventories throughout his childhood. "Sir," a technical specialist interjected, "we should document everything in situ before removal." The president nodded. "Of course, standard protocols." But his gaze remained fixed on the envelope in Elijah's hands. The potential historical significance clearly not lost on him. A photographer stepped forward, meticulously capturing images of the case and its contents from multiple angles. Meanwhile, other specialists donned archival gloves, preparing to properly handle documents that had remained sealed for 8 decades. "The cipher pads appear to be Japanese military issue," observed a gray-haired man Elijah hadn't noticed before. Clearly an intelligence analyst brought specifically for this mission. Extremely rare. Most were destroyed during the surrender to prevent analysis. When the documentation was complete, the technical team carefully transferred the contents to a specialized container designed for preserving historical documents. Only the envelope remained in Elijah's possession by silent agreement of all present. "Perhaps we should continue this in more comfortable surroundings," the president suggested, gesturing toward the farmhouse above. "History deserves better than a root cellar, however historically significant it may be." The group relocated to Elijah's kitchen, transformed now into an impromptu situation room. The humble farm table where 3 generations of Parkers had taken their meals now held materials that might reshape understanding of historical intelligence operations. Secret Service had cleared and secured the space, but allowed Elijah to occupy his usual chair, a small acknowledgement that this remained his home, despite the extraordinary circumstances. Alexandra positioned herself near Elijah, her formal military bearing softened slightly by the shared experiences of the past 2 days. The president took a seat directly across the table, flanked by senior advisors, including Colonel Harrington and the intelligence analyst who had identified the cipher pads. "Mr. Parker," the president began, Before we proceed further, I want to acknowledge the unusual position in which you find yourself. Your property, your family history, has suddenly become intertwined with matters of historical and current national security significance. Thank you, Mr. President, Elijah replied, still acclimating to the surreal reality of addressing the commander-in-chief across his own kitchen table. I'm still processing how my grandfather's service connects to today. As are we all. The President acknowledged. History rarely reveals itself in neat chronological packages. More often, it emerges in fragments that require careful reassembly. He gestured to the envelope still in Elijah's hands. With your permission, that letter might provide crucial context for understanding what your grandfather preserved and why. Elijah studied the envelope, its seal intact despite the decades underground. For when it matters most, he read aloud, his grandfather's final message, preserved alongside materials he had deemed important enough to protect from his own government. The weight of that decision, the risk William Parker had taken, settled on Elijah's shoulders. I believe he meant this to be read, Elijah said finally. Otherwise, why leave it to be found? With careful movements, he broke the seal and extracted several pages of onion skin paper covered in the same meticulous handwriting. The date at the top, August 15th, 1945, coincided with the Japanese surrender announcement. Whatever William Parker had written, he had done so at the very moment history pivoted from war to uneasy peace. Elijah glanced at the assembled officials, then back at the letter. This feels like something I should read privately first. Of course, the President agreed immediately. Family comes before government, even in matters of historical significance. We'll step outside. No need, sir, Elijah decided, realizing the inevitable oversight that would follow regardless. But I'd like to read it aloud myself. These are my grandfather's words. He deserves that much respect. The President nodded, and the room fell silent as Elijah began to read. To whoever finds this record, most likely a Parker, if my plans for establishing a family farm succeed, I am setting down the circumstances that led me to preserve these materials separate from official channels. Today, the war officially ended. News of Japan's surrender reached us hours ago, triggering celebrations among those lucky enough to have survived the Pacific campaign. I should be joining them, relieved that the planned invasion of the Japanese mainland, which would have cost countless more American lives, is no longer necessary. Instead, I find myself making a decision that may be viewed as treason by some, but which my conscience demands. The materials secured with this letter include cipher keys and diplomatic communications intercepted during the final months of conflict. As part of Marine intelligence operations attached to Navy cryptanalysis units, I was among those responsible for decoding these transmissions. What we discovered has been selectively omitted from official reports. Since April 1945, Japanese diplomatic channels had been actively seeking surrender terms, with their sole condition being the preservation of the imperial system. These overtures were systematically disregarded at the highest levels of American leadership. The official narrative will likely suggest that the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were necessary to force Japan's surrender and save American lives that would have been lost in an invasion. The intercepted communications preserved You tell a different story, one of missed diplomatic opportunities that might have ended the war without those devastating demonstrations of atomic power. I do not claim to understand all the strategic calculations involved. Perhaps there were valid reasons beyond the immediate conflict, signals directed toward the Soviet Union about America's new capabilities, or concerns about post-war geopolitical positioning. Those determinations were far above my rank. What I do know is that history deserves accuracy, even when that accuracy complicates convenient narratives. These materials provide evidence that alternative diplomatic paths existed but were not pursued. I preserve them not out of disloyalty to my country, which I have served faithfully through years of brutal combat, but out of loyalty to historical truth. I am hiding these records where I hope to build a new life beneath the foundation of American soil I intend to farm after returning home. Should these materials be discovered during my lifetime, I will accept whatever consequences come. Should they emerge after I am gone, I trust they will be used to provide more complete understanding rather than to cast unwarranted aspersions on necessary wartime decisions. The cipher keys included here may unlock additional intercepted communications that remain undecoded in official archives. Whether that information reinforces or contradicts the strategic decisions made in 1945, its existence deserves acknowledgement in the historical record. To my family, should you be the ones reading this, please understand that I acted not from disloyalty, but from dedication to the principles for which we ostensibly fought: truth, justice, and the creation of a world where power is tempered by moral consideration. Sergeant William Parker, United States Marine Corps, Intelligence Section, Elijah's voice fell silent as he finished reading. The weight of his grandfather's words hung in the air. Simple, direct language carrying profound historical implications. He carefully folded the letter, processing the revelation that William Parker had knowingly committed what might have been considered a significant breach of security protocols out of commitment to historical accuracy. The president was the first to speak, his tone measured but genuinely thoughtful. Your grandfather was a man of remarkable moral courage, Mr. Parker. Many in his position would have simply followed orders without question. He never spoke of any of this, Elijah said quietly. Not to my father, not to me. He talked about farming, about building something that would last generations, never about what he did during the war. That generation often kept their service separate from their civilian lives, Alexandra observed. Compartmentalization was a survival mechanism for many veterans. The intelligence analyst had been examining the cipher pads while Elijah read the letter. Now he looked up, his expression reflecting professional excitement contained within proper protocol. These are authentic Imperial Japanese Navy encryption materials. Specifically, they appear to be diplomatic channel ciphers used for communication with neutral countries during the final months of the war. You're a former Marine intelligence specialist with top-secret clearance and direct family connection to these materials, Colonel Harrington corrected. Your expertise in pattern analysis from your service record, combined with your understanding of your grandfather's character and motivation, could prove invaluable. The offer was simultaneously appealing and disruptive. Elijah had built his post-military life around the rhythms of agriculture, deliberately choosing the tangible productivity of farming over the shadowy world of intelligence analysis. Now that world had found him again, through a grandfather whose Service had been more complex than family stories suggested. "This would be temporary?" Elijah asked. "Initial analysis phase, approximately 6 weeks," Alexandra supplied. "Based at Fort Meade, working with historical intelligence specialists. Your farm would remain operational with support personnel during your absence." The president rose, signaling that immediate decisions were required. "Consider it carefully, Mr. Parker. Colonel Ramirez will remain to coordinate transition of the materials and can address any questions you might have." He extended his hand once more. "Regardless of your decision, I thank you for your family's service across generations. William Parker's courage, both in combat and in preserving historical truth, deserves our nation's respect." The formalities that followed passed in a blur for Elijah. Official thanks, coordination of material transfer, preparation for the president's departure. Within 30 minutes, the commander-in-chief had returned to Air Force One, the massive aircraft preparing for departure from the improvised landing strip that was Elijah's snow-covered field. As activities swirled around them, Alexandra moved to stand beside Elijah on the farmhouse porch. Together, they watched the presidential entourage prepare for departure. The surreal scene of Air Force One surrounded by Nebraska farmland, still difficult to reconcile with Elijah's understanding of his quiet, ordinary life. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man," Alexandra said quietly. "The kind of moral courage he displayed is rare in any generation." "He never talked about the war," Elijah replied. "Just taught me about farming, about responsibility to the land and community. Turns out he was carrying this weight the whole time." "Some burdens can't be shared," she observed, "not without transferring their weight to others." Elijah considered this as Air Force One's engines spooled up, the distinctive sound echoing across his fields. "Do you think he made the right choice? Keeping those materials from his own government?" Alexandra considered her answer carefully. "Intelligence work often presents ethical gray areas. Your grandfather chose historical truth over absolute adherence to protocol. I respect that kind of moral clarity, even when it complicates official narratives." The presidential aircraft began its takeoff roll, gathering speed before lifting majestically into the clear Nebraska sky. As it climbed, banking gently eastward, the assembled military personnel began the process of dismantling the temporary command post. The extraordinary presidential visit was ending, but its implications for Elijah's life were just beginning to unfold. "About the analysis position," Alexandra said, turning to face him directly. "It's not just bureaucratic convenience. Your background makes you genuinely valuable to this project." "It's been 15 years since I worked in intelligence," Elijah countered. "I deliberately chose a different path. And now that path has led you back to where you started, but with new purpose." She smiled slightly. "Life has a way of circling around like that sometimes." Elijah studied her face, recognizing something beyond professional interest in her expression. "You arranged this, didn't you? Made sure I was included in the analysis team?" "I may have emphasized certain aspects of your background when the staffing was being discussed," she acknowledged. "Former Marine intelligence, family connection to the materials, pattern recognition expertise, all factually accurate." "What's the real reason you want me involved, Alexandra?" She hesitated, then answered with unexpected candor. "Because I've seen too many classified historical reviews conducted without sufficient ethical grounding, documents analyzed for intelligence value without consideration of human impact." Your grandfather understood that balance. I suspect you do too. Her assessment struck deeper than Elijah had anticipated. His grandfather had made a difficult ethical choice in preserving potentially controversial historical materials. Now Elijah faced his own choice: return to intelligence work he had deliberately left behind, or remain focused solely on saving the farm that 3 generations of Parkers had built. As Air Force One disappeared from view, Elijah gazed across his snow-covered fields. The land his grandfather had purchased with military pay, the legacy William Parker had built while silently carrying the moral burden of his wartime decisions. Perhaps there was a way to honor both aspects of that legacy: the farming tradition and the commitment to difficult truths. 6 weeks, you said? He asked finally. Alexandra nodded. Initial phase. Potentially longer depending on what the cipher. Materials reveal. And my farm operations? Support personnel provided for essential maintenance. Your input on necessary activities, of course? Elijah made his decision. I'll do it, for my grandfather and for whatever truth these materials might reveal. Relief flickered briefly across Alexandra's features before her professional demeanor reasserted itself. I'll make the arrangements. We'll depart tomorrow, if that works for you. As military vehicles began departing his property, returning Parker Farms gradually to its normal state, Elijah contemplated the extraordinary turn his life had taken in just 48 hours. From struggling farmer facing possible foreclosure to participant in a classified historical analysis with potentially significant diplomatic implications. All because a storm had forced an Air Force colonel to land on his property. And somewhere, Elijah thought, his grandfather might be satisfied that the materials he had preserved at such personal risk would finally serve their intended purpose, revealing a more complete historical truth, however complicated that truth might prove to be. The morning light filtered through Elijah's bedroom window, casting long shadows across the floor as he packed a small duffel bag. 6 weeks away from the farm, the longest he'd been gone since returning from Afghanistan 15 years earlier. The prospect felt both disruptive and oddly liberating. Within 24 hours, the military presence had diminished substantially, leaving behind only a small security detail and support personnel who would maintain essential farm operations during his absence. In the kitchen, he found Alexandra studying his grandfather's letter, now sealed in a protective archival sleeve. She had changed from her formal dress uniform back into more practical attire, though still distinctively military in its precision. She glanced up as he entered, offering a slight smile. "Ready for Fort Meade?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Elijah replied, setting his bag by the door. "Still feels surreal. Yesterday I was worrying about feed costs and mortgage payments. Today I'm heading to the NSA to analyze World War II ciphers my grandfather buried under my root cellar." Life rarely follows predictable paths, Alexandra observed, carefully returning the letter to its protective case. "The transport will arrive in about an hour. Military flight direct to Andrews, then secure ground transportation to Fort Meade." Elijah nodded, then moved to the window overlooking his property. Most of the security barriers had been removed, though a perimeter still remained. His cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, oblivious to the extraordinary events that had transformed their owner's life. "I've arranged a briefing for the support team handling your farm operations," Alexandra continued. "They'll need your input on specific requirements, seasonal considerations, anything they should be aware of." "I've prepared notes," Elijah said, gesturing to a folder on the kitchen table. Feeding schedules, equipment maintenance, contact information for local suppliers. They're soldiers, not farmers, but the basics should be manageable for a few weeks. They're actually agricultural specialists from the Army Corps of Engineers, Alexandra corrected. Many grew up on farms before enlisting. Your property will be in capable hands. This was a relief Elijah hadn't expected. Not just security personnel, but people who understood the practical demands of agricultural operations. Another indication of how thoroughly the government had mobilized resources around his grandfather's hidden materials. There's something else you should know, Alexandra added, her tone shifting toward the professional formality he'd first encountered during the storm. The analysis team at Fort Meade includes representatives from the Japanese Diplomatic Corps. Given the nature of the materials and current diplomatic initiatives, their government has been granted limited participation. Elijah raised an eyebrow. That seems unusually open for classified historical material. The diplomatic situation is delicate. Current negotiations regarding missile defense systems in the Pacific require historical context and mutual trust building. Your grandfather's materials may provide critical background for these conversations. And I'm now part of international diplomacy? Elijah asked, unable to keep a note of disbelief from his voice. Can they still be used to decode intercepted messages in our archives? The President asked. Potentially, yes, Mr. President. Thousands of transmissions remain undecoded in national security archives. Historical analysts have been working to reconstruct these ciphers for decades with limited success. These materials could unlock significant historical information. Colonel Harrington cleared his throat. Sir, the implications for current diplomatic context could be substantial. If Sergeant Parker's assessment is accurate, these materials might significantly revise our understanding of the decision-making process surrounding the use of atomic weapons. The President nodded thoughtfully. History is rarely as straightforward as the narratives we create after the fact. He turned to Elijah. Your grandfather preserved these materials at considerable personal risk because he believed in the importance of complete historical records. That took exceptional moral courage. He was the most honest man I've ever known, Elijah said simply. If he felt this was important enough to risk being called a traitor, he must have had compelling reasons. I don't see treason here, the President replied firmly. I see a patriot who understood that true service to country sometimes requires difficult ethical choices. The easy path would have been silence. A communications officer entered the kitchen, approaching Colonel Harrington with a message that prompted immediate attention. After a brief consultation, Harrington addressed the President. Sir, we've received urgent communication from the National Security Advisor. The diplomatic situation we discussed requires your immediate attention. The President nodded, then turned to Elijah. Mr. Parker, what your grandfather preserved here may have direct relevance to ongoing diplomatic initiatives with Japan and other Pacific nations. Historical context sometimes provides unexpected leverage in contemporary negotiations. Elijah struggled to connect these dots. How could 80-year-old communications affect current diplomacy? Nations have long memories, the President explained, particularly regarding pivotal historical moments like the end of World War II. The narrative surrounding the use of atomic weapons has shaped international relations and nuclear proliferation policies for generations. Alexandra stepped forward. The current diplomatic framework for Pacific security relies partially on shared historical understanding. If that understanding shifts, then negotiating positions might shift as well, the President concluded, particularly regarding certain missile defense protocols currently under discussion. The technical implications exceeded Elijah's expertise, but the significance was clear. His grandfather's hidden cash might influence current national security policies. The responsibility felt overwhelming. "What happens now?" he asked. "To these materials to my grandfather's letter? With your permission," the President replied, "the cipher materials will be transported to a secure facility for analysis against undecoded transmissions in our archives. Your grandfather's letter will be treated as a historically significant document with appropriate classification review." "And my farm, once you've taken what you came for?" The President's expression softened slightly. "Colonel Harrington mentioned your current financial challenges. Your grandfather's service, both his official actions and his courage in preserving these materials, deserves recognition. I've directed the Secretary of Agriculture to review your situation personally." The implication was clear. Help was coming, though packaged as recognition rather than compensation for cooperation. Elijah felt conflicted emotions wash through him. Relief that his family's land might be saved, discomfort at the transactional nature of the assistance, pride in his grandfather's moral courage, and uncertainty about the historical revelations that might follow. "Mr. Parker," the President continued, "there's another matter to discuss. These materials will require careful historical contextualization. Having a Parker involved in that process would be appropriate, given your family's connection. Colonel Ramirez will be overseeing the analysis phase, given her security clearance and her original recovery of the archived debriefing that led us." Here, Elijah glanced at Alexandra, whose expression remained professionally neutral despite this unexpected development. "You want me involved in analyzing World War II diplomatic communications? I'm a farmer, not a historian." Alexandra's expression remained serious. "More accurately, you're providing historical context that may inform diplomatic processes. The President believes having a direct descendant of Sergeant Parker involved adds both practical value and symbolic significance to the analysis." The weight of this responsibility settled on Elijah's shoulders, not just family legacy now, but potential implications for international relations. His grandfather's decision to preserve these materials had created ripples across time that were still expanding. What exactly am I walking into? A specialized historical analysis unit with highest-level security clearance, Alexandra explained. Cryptographers, linguists, historical intelligence specialists. The team has been assembled specifically for this project, the first comprehensive attempt to decode the remaining Japanese diplomatic communications from the final months of World War II. And what's your role in all this? Seems like your job was just to transport the initial archives. A ghost of a smile crossed her features. My official position is liaison between military intelligence and the diplomatic corps. My doctoral dissertation focused on cryptographic evolution during the Pacific Campaign, a somewhat obscure specialization that suddenly became relevant when these materials emerged. This revelation surprised Elijah. "You have a PhD in cryptography?" "Historical cryptography," she corrected. "Military career first. Academic credentials earned through Air Force educational programs. The combination is relatively unusual, which is why I was assigned to transport the recently declassified archives that mentioned your grandfather. Elijah reassessed Alexandra in light of this information. Not just a military officer, but a specialized academic whose expertise aligned precisely with his grandfather's hidden materials. The coincidences were mounting in ways that strained credibility. You're saying that an expert in World War II Pacific cryptography just happened to crash land on the farm where critical cryptographic materials were hidden. That's quite a coincidence. Alexandra held his gaze steadily. I was transporting newly declassified files that specifically mentioned your grandfather and suggested he might have secured additional materials. When the storm forced me down, I had no idea I was landing on William Parker's actual property. That connection only emerged when I reported your name during my secure communication. And then everything accelerated. She nodded. Once the connection was established, the historical significance became clear, hence the presidential involvement and the rapid deployment of resources. The sound of approaching aircraft interrupted their conversation, a military helicopter appearing over the eastern tree line, heading directly toward the designated landing zone in Elijah's field. Our transport, Alexandra confirmed, gathering the protected case containing his grandfather's letter. The cipher materials were secured separately last night. They're already at Fort Meade. Elijah took a final look around his farmhouse, the home his grandfather had built, where 3 generations of Parkers had lived their quiet, hard-working lives. Now it would stand empty, save for military personnel, while he returned to a world of classified analysis he had deliberately left behind years ago. "Time to go," he said. More to himself than to Alexandra. He shouldered his duffel bag and followed her outside to where the helicopter was settling onto his snow-covered field, its rotors stirring crystalline clouds in the morning light. The flight to Andrews Air Force Base passed largely in silence. Both Elijah and Alexandra lost in their own thoughts as the Nebraska landscape gave way to the broader panorama of the American heartland. From Andrews, they transferred to a secure vehicle that carried them through the Maryland countryside to Fort Meade, home of the National Security Agency, and now the center of operations for analyzing his grandfather's preserved materials. Historical analysis facility occupied a nondescript building within the Fort Meade complex, its unremarkable exterior concealing cutting-edge technology and some of the most sophisticated cryptographic expertise in the world. After passing through multiple security checkpoints, each more stringent than the last, Elijah found himself in a specialized conference room where the analysis team awaited their arrival. Colonel Harrington made the introductions. Dr. Eleanor Winters, the NSA's leading expert on historical cryptography, Dr. Takashi Yamamoto, representing the Japanese Diplomatic Corps, Major Robert Chen, military intelligence specialist focusing on Pacific operations, and several technical specialists, whose precise roles remained somewhat vague in the initial briefing. Most surprising was the presence of Howard Kellerman, a tall, rail-thin man in his early 90s who rose slowly from his chair as Elijah entered. Alexandra explained in a quiet aside that Kellerman had served in naval intelligence during the latter stages of World War II, one of the few surviving members of the original cryptographic teams that had worked on Japanese diplomatic and military communications. "Mr. Parker," Kellerman greeted him, his handshake surprisingly firm despite his age. "I knew your grandfather, though briefly, We crossed paths at a forward intelligence post in the Marianas in early 1945. Remarkable man, intuitive understanding of pattern recognition that most formally trained cryptanalysts couldn't match. This direct connection to his grandfather caught Elijah off guard. He never mentioned his specific work, just that he served in the Pacific. Kellerman nodded understandingly. Most of us didn't discuss it. Classified, of course, but beyond that, the work existed in a strange moral territory. Information we decoded sometimes sent men to their deaths. Missions planned based on our analysis. Your grandfather understood the weight of that responsibility better than most. Dr. Yamamoto stepped forward, offering a formal bow before extending his hand. Mr. Parker, your grandfather's preservation of these materials may provide crucial historical context that both our nations need to move forward. I am honored to work with his descendant on this project. The formal protocols established, Colonel Harrington directed everyone to their seats for the initial briefing. The cipher materials had been carefully extracted from their protective case and now lay on a specialized examination table in the center of the room, surrounded by scanning and imaging equipment. What we have here, Dr. Winters began, indicating the materials, are Imperial Japanese Navy diplomatic cipher keys from the final phase of the Pacific War. Specifically, these appear to be the elusive Cherry Blossom series that our cryptanalysts partially broke in March 1945, but never fully decoded due to a significant cipher change in April of that year. She activated a large display screen showing magnified images of the documents. Sergeant Parker's materials include the updated cipher keys implemented in April, which would potentially allow us to decode thousands of diplomatic transmissions that remain unreadable in our archives. Major Chen continued the briefing. Based on the partial decryptions we achieved during the war, we know these communications included diplomatic outreach through neutral channels, Sweden, Switzerland, and the Vatican primarily, regarding potential surrender terms. The full content of these communications has remained speculative until now. My government has provided all surviving records from our side of these diplomatic initiatives, Dr. Yamamoto added, but many Japanese records were deliberately destroyed during the surrender process. These materials may provide the missing pieces to complete our historical understanding. Howard Kellerman leaned forward, his aged eyes sharp with memory. We knew in late spring of 1945 that the Japanese were sending peace feelers through multiple channels. The question that has remained controversial for decades is the specific nature of those overtures and how seriously they were considered by American leadership. The implications hung in the air, precisely the controversial historical territory that William Parker had referenced in his letter. If Japanese surrender initiatives had been more substantial than officially acknowledged before the atomic bombings, the historical narrative surrounding those decisions might require significant revision. Our task, Colonel Harrington said, bringing the briefing back to practical matters, is to apply these cipher keys to the undecoded transmissions in our archives. The President has authorized full access to all relevant materials, regardless of previous classification. This is to be a comprehensive historical analysis without predetermined conclusions. Dr. Winters outlined the technical approach. We'll be using advanced computational methods to apply these keys to digitized versions of the original intercepted transmissions. The process is complex. These weren't machine ciphers, but human-implemented code systems with inherent irregularities and variations. She turned to Elijah. This is where your expertise may prove particularly valuable, Mr. Parker. Your intelligence background in pattern recognition, combined with what appears to be a family aptitude for cryptanalysis, could help identify the human elements in these communications that purely computational approaches might miss. Elijah absorbed this information with growing awareness of the project's scope and significance. His grandfather had preserved these materials because he believed the full historical record deserved preservation, regardless of whether it reinforced or challenged official narratives. Now, decades later, that principle would finally be tested. "When do we start?" he asked. "Immediately," Colonel Harrington replied. "The diplomatic timeline doesn't allow for extended analysis. The President needs preliminary findings within 2 weeks to inform ongoing negotiations." The pressure of this timeline was evident in the room's atmosphere, as technical staff began initializing systems and preparing the original materials for careful scanning. Alexandra moved to stand beside Elijah as the others focused on their specific tasks. "Overwhelming?" she asked quietly. "A bit," he admitted. "Yesterday I was checking cattle feed levels. Today I'm part of a team that might rewrite World War II history. Focus on what's concrete," she advised. "The materials, the ciphers, the patterns, the broader implications will emerge naturally from the evidence." Her pragmatic approach resonated with Elijah's own tendency toward methodical problem-solving. "My grandfather would have approached it the same way," he observed. "Focus on what's in front of you. Let the bigger picture develop on its own." Alexandra smiled slightly. Family traits often run deeper than we realize. As the initial scanning process began, Elijah found himself studying the original cipher materials, delicate papers covered in precise Japanese characters and numerical sequences, annotated in some places with English notes in what he recognized as his grandfather's handwriting. William Parker had not simply preserved these documents. He had worked with them, understood them, made them accessible for future analysis. Howard Kellerman moved to stand beside him, his aged eyes following Elijah's gaze. "Your grandfather understood something fundamental about intelligence work that many never grasp," the old cryptanalyst said quietly. "Information isn't inherently good or evil. It's what happens to that information, how it's used or suppressed, that carries moral weight. You think that's why he preserved these materials? Moral consideration." Kellerman nodded slowly. "The decision to use atomic weapons has shaped global politics and military doctrine for generations. If the historical record surrounding that decision is incomplete, well, how can we learn appropriate lessons from history we don't fully understand?" The older man's perspective added weight to Elijah's growing appreciation of his grandfather's actions. William Parker hadn't simply broken protocol on a personal moral whim. He had made a carefully considered decision to preserve historical evidence that might otherwise have been permanently lost. As the day progressed, the team settled into their specialized roles. Dr. Winters and her technical staff configured advanced decryption algorithms based on the newly available cipher keys. Dr. Yamamoto provided cultural and linguistic context for translated segments. Major Chen coordinated secure access to previously classified transmission archives. Elijah found himself working alongside Alexandra and Howard Kellerman, focusing on identifying pattern relationships between the cipher keys and sample transmissions. The work was absorbing, demanding the same focused attention that intelligence analysis had required during his military service. Elijah discovered that his skills remained sharp despite years of disuse, his mind readily slipping back into the methodical processes of pattern recognition and anomaly identification. By late afternoon, the team had established a workable decryption process for testing against known transmissions. The results were promising. Messages that had previously resisted decades of decryption attempts began yielding their secrets. When processed through algorithms incorporating his grandfather's preserved cipher keys. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Winters announced, reviewing the preliminary results. "We're achieving approximately 87% decryption success on test samples. With refinement, we should reach over 90% comprehension of the previously unreadable diplomatic traffic." Colonel Harrington nodded with satisfaction. "Time estimate for processing the priority diplomatic transmissions from April through August 1945. Approximately 10 days for initial processing, another week for translation and contextual analysis," Dr. Winters replied, "assuming no significant complications." "That meets our timeline," Harrington confirmed. "The President will need preliminary findings before the scheduled discussions with Japanese officials on the 28th. Dr. Yamamoto cleared his throat politely. "I would respectfully suggest that we prioritize transmissions from mid-April 1945. Based on surviving Japanese records, that period saw significant internal government discussion about potential surrender terms." "Agreed," Harrington said. "We'll establish a chronological processing framework beginning with mid-April communications." As the initial workday concluded, the team dispersed to their assigned accommodations within the secure facility. Elijah found himself assigned quarters, adjacent to Alexandra's in the visiting specialists section. Small but comfortable rooms that reflected the military's functional approach to housing. "Processing to continue at ZO 700 tomorrow," Alexandra informed him as they walked the corridor toward their quarters. "You should get some rest. First days in secure environments are always mentally exhausting." Elijah nodded, feeling the accumulated fatigue of extraordinary revelations and intense concentration. "It's strange," he reflected. "After 15 years trying to distance myself from military and intelligence work, focusing on something tangible like farming, now I'm right back. Knew where I started. Same mental processes, same classified environment." "Not quite the same," Alexandra corrected gently. "Before, you were analyzing current intelligence to support combat operations. Now you're helping recover historical truth that might actually prevent future conflicts." Her perspective shifted. Something in Elijah's understanding of his role in this project. His grandfather had preserved these materials because he believed historical accuracy mattered, that decisions affecting millions of lives deserve to be understood in their full context, not just through simplified narratives constructed after the fact. "Get some sleep," Alexandra advised as they reached their respective doors. "Tomorrow we start tracing the actual content of those diplomatic initiatives your grandfather thought important enough to risk his career to preserve." As Elijah settled into the unfamiliar bed that night, his thoughts returned to the Nebraska farm now hundreds of miles away. For 3 generations, Parkers had worked that land, building something tangible and enduring while the wider world moved. Through cycles of conflict and peace, largely distant from their daily concerns, yet William Parker had carried historical knowledge beneath that ordinary existence, information he deemed too important to let vanish, even if revealing it might have cost him dearly. That hidden dimension to his grandfather's life suggested depths to the seemingly simple farmer that Elijah had never fully appreciated. Tomorrow, they would begin uncovering what William Parker had considered important enough to preserve at significant personal risk. Whatever those diplomatic transmissions revealed would inevitably reshape understanding of pivotal historical moments, decisions that had altered the trajectory of nations and potentially saved or cost countless lives. As sleep finally claimed him, Elijah's last conscious thought was wonder at how completely his life had transformed in just 3 days, from struggling farmer to participant in a classified historical analysis with international diplomatic implications. All because a storm had forced an Air Force colonel to land on his property, setting in motion revelations about family legacy that spanned generations and connected a Nebraska farm to world-changing historical events. Days turned to weeks as Elijah and Alexandra deciphered history together. The documents revealed what William Parker had suspected. Japan had been seeking surrender terms before the atomic bombs. This discovery reshaped diplomatic relations and secured new Pacific defense agreements between nations. But for Elijah, the greatest discovery wasn't historical. In Alexandra, he found someone who understood both worlds he inhabited, military precision and rural simplicity. When the 6 weeks ended, she surprised him by requesting extended leave to help with spring planting. 1 year later, Elijah's farm thrived, saved by government grants recognizing his grandfather's service. The root cellar was designated a historical landmark with a modest plaque honoring William Parker's courage in preserving truth. On the anniversary of the storm that brought them together, Elijah proposed to Alexandra beside that plaque. She accepted immediately. Today they run the farm, together, balancing seasonal agricultural work with consulting on historical intelligence matters. Their front porch offers a view of fields where presidential aircraft once landed, and where a simple farmer's integrity changed the course of history. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin in the most ordinary places. An unexpected storm, a chance meeting, a buried secret, and a legacy of courage that spans generations. If this story touched you, make sure you're subscribed for more incredible true tales of ordinary people whose actions changed history forever.